I will carry your dead body if I have to. That was the ultimatum a son gave to his dying father. Kermit Roosevelt refused to let Theodore commit suicide in the mud, a survival horror story, hidden in the pages of history. The jungle does not breathe. It suffocates. The air inside the canvas tent is heavy, smelling of wet wool, mold, and the sweet, sickly scent of rotting flesh. Rain hammers against the fabric roof, a relentless drumming that has not stopped for days. It sounds like 1,000 fingers tapping, waiting to get in. On a cot that is little more than rags stretched over wood, a man lies shivering. He is burning up. His body temperature is hovering near 105 degrees. He is no longer the bull moose, the rough rider, or the president. Here, in the dark heart of the Amazon, he is just meat. His hand trembles violently as he raises a small glass vial to the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. The liquid inside is amber and still. Morphine, a lethal dose. It is the only thing clean left in this world. He stares at it with a longing that terrifies him. His leg, swollen to the size of a log and black with infection, throbs in time with his racing heart. Every beat is agony. He looks across the muddy floor where his son sleeps in exhaustion, curled up like a dog. The father knows the truth. He is a burden. He is an anchor, dragging the entire expedition down into the silt. If he dies tonight, the others might live. If he stays alive, he kills them all. He uncorks the vial. The glass clicks against his teeth. He whispers lines from a poem to steady his nerves, speaking of sunless seas and caverns measureless to man. He tilts his head back, but before the liquid can touch his tongue, a sound tears through the roar of the rain. It is sharp, dry, and unmistakable. A gunshot. It is followed instantly by a scream that shreds the humidity. It is not the cry of a jaguar or the howl of a monkey. It is a human scream, filled with betrayal. The man on the cot freezes. The vial lowers. The flap of the tent bursts open, bringing the storm inside. A figure stands there, silhouetted by lightning, breathless and wild. They are not alone in the dark, and the danger is no longer just the fever or the starving river. Something has snapped. The expedition has not just failed, it has turned on itself. The man clutches the morphine tight, not sure if he should drink it or hide it. The nightmare has only just begun. To understand the nightmare, one must first understand the hubris that birthed it. The road to the jungle did not begin in Brazil, but in the mahogany libraries of New York, and the stinging defeat of the 1912 election. Theodore Roosevelt was 55 years old. He was a man built for war and command, suddenly left without an army or a nation to lead. The silence of civilian life deafened him. He did not want a vacation. He wanted to test the iron in his soul one last time. He wanted to be a boy again, reckless and immortal. He looked at the map of South America and found a blank space, a jagged question mark of a river known only as the Rio da Dúvida, the River of Doubt. No one knew where it went. No one knew if it ended in the Amazon or if it simply vanished into the earth. It was a mystery wrapped in fever, and Roosevelt reached for it with both hands. The preparation for the journey was a monument to arrogance. The expedition packed as if they were attending a garden party rather than a descent into the green hell. They loaded crates of vintage champagne and heavy oak chairs. They packed jars of gourmet mustard, olive oil, and library books dragging the heavy anchors of civilization into the wilderness. They believed that American will and British engineering could tame the chaotic heart of the tropics. They were wrong. The jungle does not care about your resume or your fine wine, but the true architects of their doom were the boats. At the edge of the water, lacking proper vessels, they purchased 7 dugout canoes from the locals. These were not the light, skimming birch bark canoes of the North American lakes that Roosevelt knew and loved. These were leviathans. Carved from the trunks of massive tropical hardwoods, each canoe weighed nearly 2,500 pounds. They were blunt, sullen beasts that sat low in the black water. They were impossible to steer, and nearly impossible to stop. To move them required back-breaking labor. To lift them over rocks was a punishment fit for the damned. They were not vehicles of exploration. They were coffins carved from trees, waiting to be filled. On February the 27th, 1914, the trap finally snapped shut. The team stood on the banks of the River of Doubt. The water looked deceptively calm, a ribbon of black glass winding into the trees. The sun was hot on their necks, a final caress from the open sky. They pushed the heavy wooden hulls into the current. The wood groaned against the mud. As they drifted downstream, the world changed instantly. The canopy of the Amazon closed over their heads like the lid of a box. The blue sky vanished, replaced by a suffocating ceiling of interlocking leaves, vines, and branches so thick that high noon looked like twilight. The air grew still and hot, trapped like steam in a kettle. The humidity rose to 100%, turning the atmosphere into a wet blanket that clogged the lungs. The sounds of the outside world faded, replaced by the high-pitched whine of millions of insects. The river pulled them forward, its current gripping the heavy keels like a giant, invisible hand. They had crossed the line on the map. They had left the world of telegraphs and doctors and warm beds. Ahead of them lay 1,000 miles of twisting water that had never seen a white man. As the last patch of blue sky disappeared behind the trees, the river began to pick up speed. A low rumble started in the distance, the sound of water smashing against rock. The River of Doubt was waking up. The river did not remain a ribbon of glass for long. It transformed into a gauntlet of shattered stone and churning white water. This was the beginning of the rapids of Navaite, a stretch of the river where the geology of the earth seemed to be at war with the water. The serene drift downstream ended abruptly. The expedition was no longer sailing. It was engaged in a brutal, muddy wrestling match with gravity. The massive dugout canoes, those 2,000-pound monsters carved from ironwood, became their curse. They could not be steered through the narrow, violent chutes of the rapids. They had to be carried, day after day. The men became mules. They stripped to their waists, their skin baking in the sun or shivering in the torrential rains that fell every afternoon. They dragged the leviathans over slick, moss-covered boulders. They hacked paths through the dense undergrowth with machetes, hauling the vessels inch by inch over logs and mud. A good day meant traveling a single mile. A bad day meant moving only a few hundred yards. The jungle watched them sweat and bleed, indifferent to their struggle. The river roared constantly, a low-frequency vibration that rattled their teeth and made sleep impossible. It was the sound of a beast chewing on stones. Then came March 15th. The river widened slightly, deceiving them, before narrowing into a furious gorge. The water accelerated, turning from black to a frothing, angry milk. Kermit Roosevelt, the president's son, was in the lead canoe. With him was Simplice, a skilled Brazilian paddler who had spent his life on the water. They were scouting a path through the turbulence. The current grabbed the heavy wooden hull. It did not pull. It jerked, snapping the canoe sideways with the violence of a breaking bone. The boat struck a rock. The sound was a dull, sickening crack that echoed off the canyon walls. The canoe capsized instantly. Kermit was thrown into the white chaos. He fought the water, his boots heavy as lead, grasping for a slippery rock, his fingers tearing at the moss. He managed to haul himself onto a stone shelf, gasping, coughing up river water. He looked back into the foam. He saw the canoe, overturned and broken, bobbing like a cork, and he saw Simplice. The paddler was fighting for his life. His head broke the surface once, his eyes wide with a terror that had no voice. He reached up, a hand grasping at the air, at the spray, at anything solid. But the river had him, a whirlpool, spun by the collision of currents, opened its mouth. It sucked Simplicio down. There was no struggle, no final cry. He simply vanished. 1 second, he was a man, a member of the team, a living soul. The next second, he was gone. The river swallowed him whole and smoothed over the spot where he had been, rushing onward as if nothing had happened. Kermit stood on the rock, dripping and shivering, staring at the empty water. The loss was total. Simplicio was dead. The canoe was gone. But the river had taken more than a life. Strapped to that boat were vital provisions, boxes of food, surveying instruments needed to map their location, rifles needed for protection. In a single heartbeat, the expedition had been stripped of its eyes and its stomach. They were now blind. They were starving, and they were one man fewer. The first blood had been spilled. The river of doubt had taken its tithe, and the survivors stood on the muddy bank, listening to the roar of the water, knowing that the river was not done eating. Hunger is not a sudden event. It is a slow, grinding subtraction. After the loss of the provisions in the rapids, the expedition entered a hollow existence. The heavy crates of gourmet mustard and fine condiments were long gone, either lost to the river or discarded in the mud to lighten the load. Now, the men ate what the jungle allowed them to take. They chopped down palm trees to harvest the bitter, white hearts hidden inside the trunks. It was cold, watery sustenance that filled the stomach but starved the blood. Occasionally, they caught piranhas, pulling the snapping, tooth-filled fish from the black water, boiling them into a thin, bony soup. The flesh of the men began to dissolve, muscles atrophied, ribs pushed against thinning skin like the rungs of a ladder. Their eyes sank deep into their skulls, giving them the haunted, hollow stare of ghosts walking before their time. But if starvation was a slow death, the insects were an immediate torture. They arrived in clouds that blotted out the dim light of the canopy. During the day, the air was thick with pea-yums, tiny biting flies that sought out every inch of exposed flesh. They did not sting. They gouged. They bit through socks and shirts, leaving behind circular, bleeding welts. The men looked as if they had been blasted by birdshot. Their hands and faces were swollen masks of red pulp. At night, the pea-yums retreated, and the mosquitoes advanced, carrying the invisible fire of malaria. The distinct whine of their wings became the soundtrack of insanity. There was no escape. To sleep was to be eaten alive. The jungle focused its greatest cruelty on the leader. Theodore Roosevelt, the man who had charged up San Juan Hill, was rotting. He had injured his leg jumping into the river to save two canoes from smashing against the rocks. The bruise did not heal. In the stifling humidity, bacteria flourished. The wound turned angry and violet, then black. An abscess formed, deep and throbbing, filling his leg with poison. The pain was a constant, blinding white noise. He could no longer walk without agony. He had to be carried over the portages, a humiliation that cut him deeper than the knife. The surgery happened in the mud, under the relentless dripping of the rain. There were no sterile walls, no anesthetics, no ether to dull the senses. Dr. Ka Za-Zeh-Ra knelt beside the former president, holding a blade that had been sterilized only by the flame of a match. Roosevelt bit down on a piece of wood. The doctor cut. The incision sliced through the blackened skin, seeking the pocket of infection. The sound of steel parting diseased flesh was swallowed by the jungle. Roosevelt turned gray, sweat pouring from his forehead to mix with the rain, but he did not cry out. He lay there, trembling, as the doctor drained the wound, a vivid demonstration of how fragile the human animal truly is. And while they rotted from the inside, something watched them from the outside. The jungle was not empty. They found the signs of the Sin-Ta-Larga tribe. A footprint pressed into the clay bank, a broken twig, an arrow left conspicuously on a table of rock, a silent warning. They never saw a face. They never heard a voice. But at night, over the sound of the rain and the chattering of teeth, they heard drums. The rhythmic beating drifted through the trees, a reminder that they were trespassers in a sovereign land. The shadows moved. The fear of an ambush kept their hands glued to their Winchester rifles, even as their fingers shook from fever. They were being hunted by ghosts, eaten by flies, and erased by the river. The descent was complete. They were no longer explorers. They were prey. Civilization is a thin veneer. It is a coat of paint that peels away when the belly is empty and the fever burns high. By early April, the expedition had been stripped of its manners, its hierarchy, and its sanity. The men were no longer soldiers or scientists. They were starving animals caged in a green prison. The tension that had been building for weeks, tightened by the screw of hunger, finally snapped. It did not break with a speech or a mutiny. It broke with a bang. Sergeant Julio was a man hollowed out by the journey. His eyes were sunk deep into his skull, two dark pits of paranoia. He watched Sergeant Paishan. He watched Paishan eat. The suspicion that Paishan was stealing food, hiding a scrap of dried meat or a handful of nuts, became a cancer in Julio's mind. The rain was falling, a relentless gray sheet that turned the camp into a swamp. Julio raised his Mauser rifle. He did not shout a warning. He did not ask for a confession. He simply pulled the trigger. The crack of the rifle was flat and dull in the wet air. The bullet struck Paishan in the chest. He fell backward into the mud, the life leaving him before he hit the ground. The blood pumped out, bright and startlingly red against the brown sludge, washing away into the river of doubt. Colonel Rondon, the iron-willed leader of the Brazilian contingent, arrived moments later. He looked down at the body of Paishan, then at the smoking rifle. There was no trial. There was no cell to hold a murderer. Julio panicked. He dropped the weapon and turned toward the wall of trees. He ran. He scrambled up the slick bank, tearing through the vines, plunging into the deep, unmapped thicket. Rondon did not order a pursuit. He did not raise his own weapon. He stood still, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat, and shouted a final decree. He yelled that they would not look for him. They would leave him to the jaguars and the silence. The jungle closed behind Julio like a curtain. He was never seen again. The forest had claimed its tithe. One man dead by lead, another dead by madness. Inside the command tent, a quieter, slower death was unfolding. Theodore Roosevelt lay on his cot, a ruined monument. The infection in his leg had spread, poisoning his blood. The fever raged at 105 degrees. He was delirious, muttering lines of poetry, his massive chest heaving with every shallow breath. He knew the mathematics of survival better than anyone. He weighed over 200 pounds, dead weight that had to be carried over the rocks. He was slowing them down. He was killing his son. He reached into his kit and pulled out the small glass vial of morphine. It was the same vial he had held weeks ago, but now the decision was solid. He called for Kermit and George Sher Rye. His voice was a rasp, weak and trembling. He told them he could go no further. He told them he was finished. He ordered them to leave him behind, to let him drink the morphine and end it in the dark, so that they might have a chance to race the starvation to the Amazon. It was a command from a father to a son, from a commander to a subordinate. But Kermit Roosevelt had changed. The boy who had started the journey in the shadow of his famous father was now the only thing keeping the old lion alive. He looked at the wasted figure on the cot. He did not weep. He did not beg. He hardened his jaw. He told his father that he would not leave him. He said he would carry him out of this hell alive, or he would carry his dead body. But he would not leave him to rot in the mud like Julio. The refusal hung in the damp air. Roosevelt looked into his son's eyes and saw a reflection of his own iron will. He put the morphine away. There would be no easy exit. They would walk out of the grave together, or they would die walking. The climax had passed. The choice was made. They turned their faces downstream, toward the unknown end. The jungle did not let them go easily. It spat them out. On April the 26th, 1914, the suffocating walls of the forest finally receded. The narrow, twisting gut of the River of Doubt opened up, spilling its black, exhausted waters into the broad, sunlit expanse of the Aripuanã River. The change was violent in its suddenness. For months, the men had lived in a world of twilight, a green tunnel where the sun was a rumor and the horizon was a distance of 10 feet. Now, the sky exploded above them, vast and blindingly white. The light hurt their eyes. They drifted out of the shadows like deep sea creatures dragged too quickly to the surface, blinking and disoriented by the sheer scale of the open world. A shape appeared on the bank. It was not a jaguar or a hostile spearman. It was a rubber tapper, a simple man making his living on the edge of the wilderness. He stopped his work and stared. He did not see a glorious expedition of statesmen and scientists. He saw a raft of floating wreckage. He saw men who looked like famine victims, their clothes reduced to rotting rags that hung off protruding bones. Their skin was a tapestry of ulcers, insect bites, and sun-scorched leather. They were bearded, filthy, and trembling with the residual vibrations of malaria. They were the walking dead, emerging from a place that did not exist on any map. The rescue was not a triumph. It was a salvage operation. When Theodore Roosevelt was lifted from the canoe, the shock rippled through those who came to help. The bull moose was gone. In his place stood an old man, broken and hollow. He had lost over 50 pounds. His powerful chest, once the symbol of American vigor, was sunken. His leg was a ruin of scar tissue and lingering infection. He leaned heavily on a walking stick, his eyes burning with a fever that would never truly leave him. He had entered the Amazon to reclaim his youth, to prove that he was still the cowboy of the Dakotas. The Amazon had taken that youth, chewed it up, and swallowed it. He had aged 10 years in 2 months. They returned to New York, but they did not return whole. The maps were redrawn. The twisting, deadly snake of water they had charted was no longer the river of doubt. It was christened the Rio-Rose of Velt, a permanent scar of blue ink across the heart of Brazil. It was 1,000 miles of water named after a man who had nearly drowned in it. The geography was conquered, the blank space filled in, but the victory was Pyrrhic. Roosevelt spent his remaining years fighting the ghost of the jungle. The fever hidden in his blood flared up again and again, a reminder of the mosquitoes that had clouded the air at night. The abscess in his leg plagued him until the end. He wrote books. He gave speeches. He defended the truth of his journey against skeptics who claimed a former president could not have survived such a hell. But the energy that had defined a generation was gone. He died in his sleep in 1919, just 5 years after pulling his boots out of the Amazon mud. He was 60 years old. The doctors gave it a medical name, a coronary embolism. But the truth was written on the map of South America. The river had taken his life. It simply waited 5 years to come and collect the debt. The expedition was over. But the silence of the forest remained, waiting for the next fool to step into the green dark.